Hi everyone, this is an LSAT hacks video on when to draw LSAT logical reasoning questions, and this is something you should rarely do. First of all, what do I mean by drawing? I'm talking about conditional statements. So if I say something like cats have tails, you probably know you can draw it as C arrow T, and the contrapositive is not T arrow, not C. If this is unfamiliar to you, then you should check out some videos on doing conditional reasoning diagrams, because that's what I'm talking about in this video. And it's a very useful skill to be able to do, but the thing is, most questions don't actually do this. So when a question has conditional reasoning, it's extremely useful to draw it, but when people learn this skill, they often overdo it, and they're trying to draw all these questions that actually aren't using conditional reasoning. So you, first of all, only can draw questions where conditional reasoning is present, and second, you also shouldn't do it gratuitously, because sometimes you don't need to draw it. Like, if you just read the sentence, cats have tails, you don't have to make that drawing to know what it means. And so if there's just one conditional statement in a question, then generally you don't draw it. I personally draw about 0 to 3 questions per section. And, it's usually like 0 to 1 or maybe 2, but 1 is a typical number. And when you're learning, you might draw as many as 5, but likely less. And when I say as many as 5, it's because there are a few questions where there's maybe a single conditional statement, and to help with your understanding of it or just to practice drawing, maybe you would draw those. But once you get moderately skilled, you would only aim to draw ones where you're actually connecting together statements. Yeah, you only want to do it when you can actually connect together pieces of logic, because what happens is, with some things, if there's like 4 conditional statements, you just can't really hold that all in your head. So making little drawings helps you to get it out of your head and onto the page, and it lets you compare that logic to the answers. That's where drawing is useful. It's not a magic tool that you have to do every time it's there. It's just a brain shortcut. How to know when to draw is you look for conditional words. So like if, then, must, will, not, are, unless, always, only if, every. And then there's lots of rarer ones, but these are the main ones. And look for these in multiple sentences. That indicates multiple conditional statements. So here's an example of a question type not to draw. Flaw questions will sometimes use a single conditional statement. They'll say something like all A's are B's, and then they'll conclude all B's are A's. This is an incorrect reversal. And if you need to draw this to figure out that they've done an incorrect reversal, then fine, you can do it. But you should aim to get good enough with this that you don't have to draw it, because that's the whole flaw. They do a conditional statement, they get it backwards. Or they do a conditional statement, they incorrectly negate it. If you see a single conditional statement on a flaw question, that's probably the answer, and you probably don't have to draw it to do it, because it's not something bigger than what you can hold in your head. You just look at the evidence and the conclusion, you see they reversed it, and then you look for that answer. Where you really should do it is when they're having multiple statements together. So which question types are often drawn? I would say must be true, but not most strongly supported. People often confuse those, but they're different. Most strongly supported does not use conditional reasoning. Almost never it does. Sufficient assumptions, but not necessary. They're very different types of questions. Sufficient assumptions do use conditional reasoning, and it's very helpful to draw these when applicable, when they actually do use it. A lot of principal questions, especially principal application. Parallel and flaw parallel, again, not all of them. You only draw them if there's conditional reasoning. And usually here you would draw the reasoning in the stimulus and then pick 2 answers that seem most plausible and draw those. And that's about it. I mean, you might occasionally draw some other type of question, but off the top of my head, there's none that I draw regularly other than this set. So while it's a very useful skill to have, it's not something that you're going to be doing that much. It's a very easy skill to teach, and so LSAT books and instruction will put a lot of emphasis on it, and this is appropriate that you need to learn this well, but people can take the wrong lesson and try and think that there should be drawing it all over the place, when that's not the case. Now, I thought I would look at one sample question to illustrate how to draw, or an example of a question where you should draw. This is from Prep Test 30. If you don't have access to that prep test, that's fine. You can still watch this video and you can hear some of the keywords. But to get full understanding, you would best pause the video and check out the question. And the question is on Prep Test 30, Section 2, number 18. So ideally, stop the video, do that question, and then watch, or at least just read over it. Now, why do I say this should be drawn? Well, the first sentence starts with if, and then they say the audience will be. So this is a conditional statement. They got one conditional statement, then statement 2, will not unless. This is one people often find tricky. I'll explain how to draw that. And the third statement, this comes after the and. To be a, this is giving a requirement. I.e., you might say to be a cat, you must have a tail. I'll go into this. To be a, one must. So there are 3 statements, all with conditional indicators. This means you should draw. So if that indicates a sufficient condition, so if there's an inspired musical performance, I never normally do 3 statement things. So if there's an inspired performance that leads to a good show, there will be a good show. Then will not unless. Okay, so people find this hard. I can say you will not be a cat unless you have a tail. That makes intuitive sense, right? If I say you will not be a tail unless you have a cat, that doesn't make sense. I like using the cat tail example because you're not going to mix it up with some, like, it's simple enough that you can think about it, but it doesn't present any like traps where you'll get it backwards. So you will not be unless. So really, what comes in front, or what comes along with the will not, is actually the sufficient condition. So if they say you will not be a cat, you just write cat. Unless you have a tail, you write tail. But obviously we're not talking about cats and tails, so here they're saying there will not be a good show, so that's sufficient. You just sort of ignore the not and write it as it is. Unless there are sophisticated listeners, so you need sophisticated listeners. And to be a sophisticated listener, you must understand musical roots. And so we can combine these together. So if there's an inspired performance, there'll be a good show, but a good show requires sophisticated listeners in the audience who understand their roots. So if there's an inspired performance, we can conclude at the end, there's people who understand their, understand their roots as the necessary condition. So you could write UMR, because you see I got confused about, like, why did I write UR? I forgot I was looking for music in there, but it's not really a big deal. And you could also take the contrapositive of this. Like, personally, I don't draw these, but if you're just getting started and you find it difficult to see the contrapositives in your head, then you can draw it. Basically, I'm just, you reverse everything and you negate it. Now, if you look at the answers, so what you should be looking for is either something that goes from left to right along either of these chains. So I would first of all skim over the answers and just look for something like nothing here leading to nothing there, or something here leading to something there. And I'll probably do the contrapositive. But I guess, like, the big picture thing I want you to know is that, this is a lot of complex information. So this is absolutely appropriate to draw because we have like 3 different statements that we all join together in one chain. And that's the prime example of when you would draw. If a question is not doing this, you shouldn't be drawing it. If it's just one statement, then that's really borderline. And if there's no statements, then, well, why would you try and draw? I hear so much people trying to draw like necessary assumption questions or something where they just aren't using conditional statements most of the time. So you really want to be looking for these kinds of terms in the stimulus, not like in the answer, because there's a lot of necessary ones in the answer, but drawing it does you nothing there. Yeah, so let's see how this answers the question. A says no sophisticated listeners, no inspired performance. That's correct. And we can see that by following our diagram. And you can see like B negates good show and understand roots and forms a statement out of them, which is an incorrect negation, so it's not B. C says if you understand musical roots, now you can't start at the sufficient and go backwards. Sorry, you can't start at the necessary and go backwards. You have to start at the sufficient and go rightwards. So C is going to be an incorrect reversal. And so notice that I just looked at the first statement. I didn't even read all of it. I just said, if there are people who understand roots, and I saw right away this couldn't lead to anything because there's nothing to the right of it. That's the power of conditional statements. You can just see what's the sufficient, what's this going to let me conclude. If it lets me conclude nothing, it can't be right. So D says good show unless. No, the only thing that lets us conclude good show is if you have this, then you can conclude good show. But D is making a statement like you will have a good show unless something. But to prove that you have a good show, you need to start with IP, and that's not what this answer is doing. It talks about musical roots instead. So, and E says if there's sophisticated listeners, then there'll be inspired performances. This is going right to left. That's backwards. You can't do that. So it's A. And, in time conditions, if I was sure of my diagram and I was sure that A matched it, I would probably skim the others and make sure that I just haven't made a stupid mistake, but you're pretty safe on A. Anyway, I hope this helps show you when to draw and when not to draw. Basically, if something looks like this, then you should have drawn it. If not, then the question is really just about thinking about what the words in front of you mean, and diagrams don't add anything.